Hey there. Are you ready to jump into some global economic stuff today?
Always ready.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So today we're looking at Trade Wars Are Class Wars
Right.
by Klein and Pettis.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing on Chapter 4.
Very important chapter.
Yeah, which really gets into China's rise as an economic superpower.
It's a really fascinating story, too, because it happens so fast, historically speaking.
Yeah, and I think it leaves a lot of economists just scratching their heads.
It's really hard to understand.
Yeah, so, we've got this book and they break it down. And Chapter 4 really focuses on this idea of China's surplus.
Which is really at the heart of it, yeah.
So can we just start off by, what makes understanding China's surplus so important? What does that tell us?
Well, it's not just about the size of the surplus, right? It's about how they got there.
Oh, okay.
And Klein and Pettis, they outline these 4 distinct stages of China's surplus growth.
Oh, okay.
And each stage has its own causes and consequences. It's really interesting how they divide it up.
Yeah, so let's, dive into those stages.
Okay.
So stage 1, set the scene for us.
Okay. Imagine China before it was the factory of the world.
Oh, okay.
Right. So pre-1994, China was relatively isolated.
Okay.
They focused more on import substitution, making things for themselves,
Okay.
rather than trading globally.
Okay.
Their trade surplus was pretty small because they weren't really participating that much in the global economy.
Okay, so it was a slow burn. It was kind of doing its own thing.
Yeah, they were getting ready.
Okay, and then 1994 happens. They join the World Trade Organization, and then, bam, stage 2 starts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They step onto the world stage.
Yeah.
Suddenly, everyone wants what they're selling.
Yeah.
Foreign investment pours in. Their exports just go through the roof.
Okay.
And that surplus starts to really climb.
Okay.
So this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, so stage 3, 2001 to 2008.
Yeah, okay.
What happened here?
This is the big aha moment, right?
Okay,
So think about all those made in China labels you started seeing everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
That's no accident. China made a strategic decision.
Oh.
They pegged their currency, the yuan, to the U.S. dollar.
Oh.
This made their exports super cheap compared to other countries.
Oh.
And as a result, their surplus just exploded.
So that was a really key factor.
Oh, absolutely. It was a brilliant move.
Oh, wow.
For a time.
Okay, so then we get to stage 4, 2008 to the present.
Yeah.
And, of course, we have the financial crisis in 2008.
Right.
So did that have any impact on China's surplus?
It did. It did. Growth slowed down.
Okay.
It wasn't quite as explosive as before.
Okay.
So the surplus continued, but at a slower pace.
Okay.
They also started to look inward more.
Okay.
Spending more on infrastructure domestically. Right? So it's they're realizing they can't just rely on exports forever.
Right.
They have to start thinking about internal growth, too.
Yeah. Okay, so these 4 stages, they really do paint a picture of how China's surplus evolved over time.
Yes.
So what were the secret ingredients? What was in their recipe for economic success?
Well, there are 3 main mechanisms that Klein and Pettis point to, and the first one might surprise you.
Okay.
It's actually suppressing consumption.
What?
Yeah.
That's so weird.
Policies were designed to encourage saving,
Oh.
not spending.
Okay.
So people had a lot of money tucked away,
Okay.
but it wasn't circulating in the economy.
Interesting. So there was money, but people weren't spending it.
Right.
Okay, what's the next ingredient in this stew?
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you're finding value in what I'm sharing, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all my latest content. And don't forget to tap the notification bell. That way, you'll get a heads up every time a new video drops, so you won't miss a thing. Plus, it really helps the channel grow. So thank you. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing from you. Thanks again for watching, and let's keep growing this amazing community together.
Investment. Lots and lots of investment.
Okay.
China poured money into infrastructure and manufacturing,
Okay.
even building more than their own people needed.
Wow.
So this meant they had even more to export, which further fueled their surplus.
Okay, so save more, produce more.
Exactly.
And then the third thing, of course, is that currency peg.
Right. That's the final piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so how did that play into it?
Well, managing their exchange rate like that, keeping the yuan pegged to the U.S. dollar, gave China a massive advantage.
Whoa.
It kept their goods artificially cheap on the global market.
Okay.
So it's they found a way to undercut everyone else.
And it worked.
It did. It did. For a time.
But I have a feeling this economic strategy, there must be downsides, right? Like, what were the consequences?
Oh, absolutely. For one thing, it created tension with other countries.
Oh, okay.
The U.S. in particular was not thrilled about China's currency practices
Oh, I can imagine.
and how it was impacting American businesses and workers.
Okay, so it wasn't just China. This was impacting other countries too.
Oh, yeah. It had this huge ripple effect.
Okay.
And that's where that whole trade wars part of the book title comes from.
Oh, okay.
So it was really affecting a lot of different players.
So these internal policies in China really had global consequences.
It's incredible, yeah. It just shows how interconnected everything is.
Yeah. But what about the impact on, like, the Chinese people themselves?
That's a really important question, right? Because while the economy was booming, the people weren't necessarily reaping all the benefits.
Oh, wow.
You know, suppressed wages and limited social safety nets meant many people were struggling,
Wow.
even as the country became this economic powerhouse.
That's so interesting. So it's like, it's a complex story.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just black and white.
Yeah. So listeners, you're starting to see why understanding these 4 stages is so important. It's like, it helps us understand how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, exactly. It gives us the whole picture.
Yeah. And in our next segment, we're actually going to look at how China's economic rise played out in the everyday lives of people both in China and beyond. So stay tuned.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about how China's choices impacted other countries.
Yeah.
It really is true. Like, what happens in one place doesn't stay there.
Yeah. That's saying no man is an island.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Countries aren't islands either.
Yeah. And Klein and Pettis, they talk about this really interesting term,
Okay.
the exorbitant burden.
Oh, yeah.
What is that?
So it's kind of like the flip side of exorbitant privilege,
Okay.
which we usually think of with like the US dollar
So, okay.
being like the world's reserve currency.
Right.
But for China, it's more about like the downsides of holding so much of that currency.
Okay. So how does holding all those US dollars become a burden for China?
Well, think about it. China, with all that exporting and the way they were managing their currency,
Uh-huh.
ended up with like a ton of foreign exchange reserves.
Okay.
Remember all those overflowing coffers we talked about?
Right. Yeah.
Well, a huge chunk of that is in US dollars.
Yeah. Because they were getting paid in dollars for everything.
Exactly.
So what's the problem with holding dollars? Isn't that a good thing?
Well, it's not so simple. Having all those dollars tied up in reserves
Okay.
means China is essentially financing U.S. consumption and investment.
Right.
It's like they're lending money to the U.S. even if it's not on purpose.
Oh.
And the returns on those dollar-denominated assets?
Yeah.
Not that great.
Oh, so China's shouldering this burden of financing the U.S. economy.
Right.
But at the same time, their own people might not even be benefiting that much from their hard work.
It is pretty crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, so it creates this interdependence
Oh, absolutely.
between the two countries.
Yeah.
China needs the U.S. market for their exports,
Mm-hmm.
but they're also like financially tied to the U.S. through all those dollars they're holding.
It's very complicated.
It's a high-stakes game.
That is.
Like they're both in this economic tango,
Exactly.
and they can't step on each other's toes.
Yeah, they got to be careful.
So we've got China and the U.S. in this economic dance.
Mm-hmm.
But Klein and Pettis, they also bring in Germany.
Oh, yes.
Germany, what
Well-
do they have to do with all of this?
Germany might seem like a world away, but their policies really do have a global impact.
Okay.
So they have this strong export-oriented economy like China,
Okay.
but they also really emphasize fiscal austerity.
Fiscal austerity. So they're big savers.
Basically, yeah, they're really good at saving money and not spending too much.
Okay, so Germany's like the world's super saver.
You could say that.
How does that tie into these global imbalances?
All that saving, you know, creates a surplus of capital.
Okay.
And that capital needs somewhere to go.
Yeah.
It flows outward looking for investment opportunities in other countries.
And where does it end up?
You guessed it,
The U.S.
the U.S. So German surplus capital flows into the U.S.
Oh, wow.
It fuels consumption there. It can even contribute to asset bubbles.
So it's like one country's surplus is another country's deficit.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how imbalances can feed each other.
So it's really this interconnected global financial ecosystem.
It is. We're all part of it in one way or another.
So we've seen how China and Germany contribute to these imbalances with their policies. But is there like a way to untangle this web?
That is the question, isn't it?
Like, is there a way to create a more balanced system?
Well, Klein and Pettis, they think both China and Germany need to change some things.
Okay.
They talk about rebalancing, shifting away from this dependence on exports
Okay.
and focusing more on domestic consumption.
So instead of just selling stuff to everyone else, they need to help their own people buy more.
That's the idea.
Okay, so boosting the purchasing power of their own citizens.
Uh-huh.
How do you do that?
Well, for China, it could involve things like reforming their hukou system,
Okay.
strengthening social safety nets, maybe letting wages grow more.
So create an environment where people feel comfortable spending.
Exactly.
What about Germany? What would they need to do?
Maybe move away from those strict austerity measures,
Okay.
invest more in infrastructure social programs,
Okay.
try to stimulate demand at home rather than just relying on exports to drive growth.
So finding that balance between internal and external factors.
Right. It's about recognizing that a healthy global economy needs cooperation, and everyone's got to be willing to adjust. No one can thrive in isolation.
And it's also about remembering that behind all the economic stuff,
Yeah.
there are people
Real people.
whose lives are impacted by these decisions.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that true prosperity comes from shared growth and fairness.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges and potential solutions,
Uh-huh.
but let's go back to those 4 stages of China's surplus growth we talked about earlier.
Right.
Can we break down each stage a little more
Sure.
and see what was really happening?
Yeah, let's rewind back to stage 1, pre-1994,
Okay.
when China was still figuring things out economically.
Right, doing its own thing.
They were pretty isolated, focusing on import substitution.
Import substitution.
Yeah, basically they were trying to make everything they needed themselves instead of relying on imports.
Oh, so it's like they had this closed-off system. They were just experimenting
All right,
before they went global.
exactly. And during that stage, their trade surplus was pretty small
Okay.
because they weren't really participating in the global economy that much.
Okay, so it was like a time of incubation
Yeah, you could say that.
before their full potential was unleashed.
Right.
And then comes 1994. They join the World Trade Organization.
Right.
And stage 2 begins. Things start heating up.
Exactly. It's like they flung open the doors and said, "Come on in, world."
Right. The world's their oyster.
This move gave them access to those international markets,
Okay.
and it attracted tons of foreign investment.
Wow.
Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the action.
Right. So all this capital starts flowing in, fueling that export-driven growth.
Right, and the trade surplus starts to really grow.
So it was a period of rapid expansion.
You could say that.
China becomes a major player in global trade.
They're a force to be reckoned with.
And then we hit stage 3,
Okay.
2001 to 2008.
Yeah,
The surplus just explodes.
this is where things get really interesting.
So what was happening here?
Well, this is when the currency peg we talked about really comes into play.
Okay.
By keeping the yuan pegged to the US dollar.
Yeah.
They made their exports super cheap compared to other countries. Okay.
And their surplus went through the roof.
It's like they figured out how to undercut everyone.
And it worked.
Yeah, for a while.
For a time.
Then we had the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
Stage 4 begins.
Yeah, things start to shift.
Does the surplus go down?
It does. It starts to decline.
Okay.
Not completely, but it slows down.
Okay.
Partly because the whole global economy slowed down.
Right, demand for Chinese goods dropped.
Exactly.
But were there internal things going on too?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like what?
Well, labor costs were rising in China,
Okay.
and they were starting to face competition from other emerging economies.
Okay.
Plus, they started trying to boost demand at home
Okay.
by spending more on infrastructure.
So it's like they realized they couldn't just keep relying on exports forever.
They had to start looking inward a little bit.
So stage 4 really shows how hard it is to keep up that export-driven growth over time.
It's not easy. Things change.
The economic models have to adapt.
Exactly.
So it's like they hit a plateau.
And they needed a new way forward.
Right, but what does that path look like?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Can China transition to a more balanced economy?
Right, one that's driven by consumption.
Exactly. Will they face more challenges as those global imbalances persist?
These are big questions that will shape the whole global economy.
Yeah, the impact of all of this goes way beyond China.
It really shows how interconnected we all are.
It does. What happens in China doesn't stay in China.
Right. We have to stay informed.
We do.
Keep learning
Keep asking questions.
to understand what's shaping our world.
It's important.
Because these economic policies and trends, they have real consequences
They do.
for people all over the world.
We can't ignore it.
No.
We have to see how everything's connected and recognize our shared responsibility to create a better, more stable economic future.
A future where everyone benefits.
Exactly. And sometimes to understand all of this,
Yeah.
We have to go beyond just the headlines.
Right.
We have to look at the details, the nuances, the history. We have to understand the human impact of all of this.
It's about seeing the forest and the trees.
A good way to put it.
So let's zoom in on one really interesting part of China's rise
Okay.
that Klein and Pettis talk about,
What's that?
the impact on Chinese workers.
Right.
It's a story that's often overlooked.
It is, but it's a crucial part of the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's a story that shows the human cost
Yeah.
of these economic choices.
And it's a story with implications for workers everywhere.
It's really easy to just focus on like the big numbers, right? When we talk about China's economic rise.
Yeah, the GDP growth and all that.
But what about the people?
Exactly. What was it like for the average worker in China during all of this?
Yeah, like their lives must have been impacted.
Absolutely. It's a complex story, though.
Okay, how so?
On the one hand, millions of people were lifted out of poverty as China's economy took off.
Okay,
There were new opportunities and living standards improved for a lot of people.
so that's good.
It is, but it wasn't all positive. Klein and Pettis, they talk about some serious challenges that Chinese workers faced.
Even as the country's economy was booming.
Even then,
What were some of those challenges?
one of the biggest ones was suppressed wages.
Suppressed wages.
Yeah, remember those policies we talked about that were meant to encourage saving and keep exports cheap?
Uh-huh.
Well, those same policies often kept wages low.
So even though China's economy was growing, wages weren't really keeping up.
Exactly, and that made it hard for people to really share in the prosperity.
So they weren't seeing the benefits.
Not as much as they could have. And on top of that, there weren't strong social safety nets in place.
Okay.
Things like healthcare and retirement benefits were often limited.
So workers had to handle more of that themselves.
Less money in their pockets and more financial insecurity.
It sounds like a recipe for some problems.
It definitely created challenges for a lot of workers. And it raises some questions about China's model.
Yeah.
Was it really sustainable to prioritize exports and keep consumption low?
At the expense of their own people.
Exactly. And that's something Klein and Pettis explore in the book.
It's an important question, and it has implications for workers all over the world.
Because what happens in China doesn't stay in China.
Right. It affects us all.
It's all interconnected.
So how does it impact workers in other countries?
Well, when one country relies on suppressing wages to be competitive,
Okay.
it puts pressure on other countries to do the same.
Oh, wow.
It can become this race to the bottom with workers everywhere losing out.
It's a scary thought. So I guess the big takeaway from Chapter 4 is that economic growth doesn't automatically mean everyone benefits.
That's exactly right. It's crucial to look beyond just the numbers and think about the human impact.
Who's winning and who's losing?
Exactly. We need to ask those questions not just about China, but about every country.
Because a healthy economy should work for the people.
It should not, the other way around.
It's about finding that balance between growth and equity, between what countries want and global cooperation.
And that's a tough challenge for policymakers.
It is. Can we create a system that works for everyone, not just a few?
A system that's sustainable, fair, and good for workers all over the world.
That's the goal.
It is, and trade wars or class wars gives us a way to understand these complicated issues.
Yeah, and to see what's at stake.
Exactly. So as we wrap up today, listeners, I hope you'll think about how these global economic forces affect you.
What role do we each play in creating a fairer, more sustainable future?
Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Because the more we know, the better we can make things.
That's what it's all about.
Thanks for joining us today for another deep dive.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new content. I've got a lot more coming your way, and I'd love for you to be part of this journey with me. And if you found this helpful, please give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.